Hello, I'm Jerry Stewart here with another video presentation. Now today, the day that I'm doing this video is September the 17th, 2019. You say, what is so special about September the 17th? Well, I'm sure there's lots of birthdays today. But what makes today special in the United States is today is what they call Constitution Day. This was the day 232 years ago today was the day that they actually signed the Constitution to our United States. And the story I'm about to tell you, you did not hear this story in school. Well, remember, in 1776 is when we declared our independence from England. And the battle began, and the battle went on, and on, and on, until finally the Brits gave up. America got their freedom. But then what? Well, there had to be some sort of plan, some kind of a written, rules. They call it the Constitution. Had to be written to tell us as a nation how we were going to function. So a band of men got together in 1787 and they began to try their best to pound out how our nation would function. Didn't go well. Didn't go well at all. As a matter of fact, the biggest problem was it was 13 colonies. Some of the colonies, especially the larger colonies like New York and Pennsylvania, they wanted representation on voting matters and such to be based on population. And of course, they had the largest population in all the colonies, and so they would have a lot of power. Now, the smaller colonies, they wanted it to be an equal vote by each, meaning 13 colonies get 13 votes. So they were having this conflict of what to do, and quite frankly they couldn't come up with a solution. So the way the story goes, some of the representatives said, this isn't going to work. We're going to leave, we're just going to go back, we're going to tell our colonial folks that we could not come up with an agreement, and we're not going to be the United States of America. We're just going to be independent colonies, countries, something. They said we're all just about ready to give up. There was a man who had been around for a very, very long time, Benjamin Franklin. Benjamin Franklin was 87 years old, and he stood up and said, sirs, if I may have a word. Before we leave, hear me out. He said this: if it's true that a sparrow cannot fall to the ground without God hearing, then it's certainly true that a nation cannot be formed without His mighty help. And he began to speak to them about how they had never brought God into the specific portion or part of Him helping them to write the Constitution. And he asked them if they were willing to get on their knees and pray, and to spend some time in prayer, and not to give up just yet. Well, they all agreed that they would take time and pray, and that every day they met, they would start the meeting with not just a simple little short prayer, but genuine prayer to God, asking Him to help them. And they set forward, and as we all know, of course, we ended up with a Constitution. And those who study the government documents around the world in history will tell you that one of the greatest single documents in the history of the world is the U.S. Constitution. Now, I've said all that to say this: God was part of forming our country not just in our battles, not just at Bunker Hill when the men had to face odds that were overwhelming, not just in other times and circumstances and situations, but God was with our folks when they went to try to build a country. And you know, that's what God does. When people come to him and ask him for help, if they come to him with a heart to listen and to follow, he will help. Now, there is a final piece to this story. After they actually completed the Constitution, the writing of the Constitution, and they had it all ready for everyone to sign, there were a number of those who had helped pen the Constitution, get this, that refused to sign it into law. Now, those who were in charge said, "What are you talking about? We spent all this time, all this effort. We've gone to God. We've worked together. We've thought all of the pieces through. Why won't you sign?" And they said, "There are some things that we are concerned about. We are concerned about certain rights that no matter what, these rights will not be taken away from us." They sat down and they wrote out what they were thinking about, and they came up with 10 different pieces that came to be known as the Bill of Rights. Now, today, there are some, especially in the middle of this whole matter of the Democratic selection for president, there's a lot of talk, a lot of jaw dropping, a lot of lip moving, a lot of hot air. And some are saying, we don't care what the 10 Bill of Rights stand for. We don't care that those who wrote the Constitution would not sign the Constitution unless these 10 Bill of Rights became foundational to the rights of the citizens. I'm not going to name them all here, but let me give you a couple. First of all, there's a lot of talk in our nation today about this matter of God in our government. And there are some that have taken that second part of that First Amendment, saying that the government would establish no religion. And they've made it to be this thing that everybody calls separation of church and state. And there is nothing that's farther from the truth than using that analogy. How do I know? I've studied it. I've read it. And I can also tell you that the man who wrote that second part to that amendment, his name was Fisher Ames. Got a very interesting story. So, first of all, why would they have put that in the Constitution as a basic Bill of Rights? Well, prior to America becoming free, they had been under the rule of Britain. Now, the British government had a church called the Church of England. And those who did not choose to follow the Church of England had trouble, had problems. In fact, all the way back to the 1600s, the Pilgrims had been actually driven out of England because they refused to make the Church of England their church. Now, why didn't they want to follow? Well, first of all, the head of the Church of England was not Jesus Christ. The head of the Church of England was the Queen. And the Pilgrims said, we're not going to be a part of any church that a person is the head of. We're only going to be a part of a church that Jesus Christ is the head. Well, so whenever England had authority, over the colonists, they continued to press for the Church of England. And the people said, those who refused to sign the Constitution and wanted this amendment added, they said, no matter what, we want for people not to have the authority of the government over them, telling them what religion to follow. Now, having said that, that doesn't mean that somehow they wanted God out of our government activity. It doesn't mean that at all. As a matter of fact, back then, well, look at the Declaration of Independence. God is mentioned 6 times in the Declaration of Independence. When George Washington was sworn in as the first president of our United States, he insisted that he would have a Bible there with him, and that he would swear on the Bible, and that he would finish his swearing in with these words, "So help me God." Then he went on to do his presidential speech, and he talked on and on about how God had helped our country to win our battle for independence. So you think about that. There's no doubt they believed with all their heart that the foundational principles in our nation were to be the Judeo-Christian principles of the Bible. To be responsible, to be hardworking, to be kind, to be a lawful person. All of those things that the Bible has foundationally. Now, you say, yeah, but what about having God in our public schools? Glad you asked me that. The gentleman who wrote that second part of the amendment to the Constitution, which talks about there being no formal government religion, interestingly enough, he had a few ideas about what the public schools were going to function like. And he wanted specifically to talk about the reading classes. Now, we're talking public schools, not private schools. He believed that the number one textbook in public schools should be, you got it, the Bible. Now, if a man was determined to keep God out of the public schools, why in the world would he at the same time determine that he wanted the Bible to be the number one reading textbook in all of the public schools? You see, it just doesn't make sense. You know why it doesn't make sense? It's because when people tell you their story, they're wrong. They had no idea that they somehow would imagine that God would have to be pushed out of all government affairs, that there could be no prayers at football games, that you couldn't have a prayer at school, that you couldn't have places in our country where crosses could be set up. That doesn't mean that they're going to make people worship in that way. But listen, folks, we can't take a handful of people in our country who don't want to follow God and have them make us push God out of our nation. Now, the last part is this. There's a second amendment, and it talks about the citizens having the right to bear arms, meaning to be able to own and carry weapons. Now, it's a terrible thing these days that a few are taking guns and making horrible, horrible things happen, and that they are killing people with guns. And some say, well, you know, the best thing to do is just take all the guns away from the law-abiding citizens. And I say, how foolish can that be? If you take away my gun and someone comes in my house, how am I going to protect myself and my family if I've got nothing to protect myself with? And to imagine that somehow those who break the law, those who take guns and kill people and harm people with those guns, that somehow they're going to quit carrying because my gun is taken away from me? Nope, absolutely not. Now you wonder, why did they care back then whether people had the right to bear arms? Here's the answer. When they decided that they were going to do the pushback, the breaking away from England, do you know the first thing that the British Army did? They went around to all the stocking places where they kept all of the gunpowder and all of the ammunition, and they began to confiscate all of that. They began to take away people's long arms, their firearms. You know why? Because how can I fight you if you've got a gun and I don't have a gun? How can I stand against an army who's got all of the rifles and all the guns and all the cannons and I've got nothing? Listen, folks, the people who wrote the Constitution insisted that no matter what, we as U.S. citizens would have the right to carry, to own, to bear arms, to keep them in our home, to be able to carry them outside of our homes in case we're in a restaurant or somewhere where some sort of a wild maniac shooter comes in. Now, does that mean that I'm not concerned about who has a gun? Of course not. There are people who, because of their history, because of their criminal background, they should not be allowed to own or even hold a gun. But that's not what some are saying. Some are saying, take all the guns away. So, the point is this. We have to understand today that there are people who are putting thoughts in our minds who don't know what they're talking about. They either haven't bothered to read the history of why things were made the way they were made, or they just don't care. I'm Jerry Stewart. I'd like to hear what you think. You know, the best way for us to make headway in our country is to quit listening to all the talking heads on TV and to talk between each other. If you've got something that you want to say it to me. Send me some feedback so that we can have conversation. That's how we're going to solve the problems of our nation, with one other part: prayer. We need to be praying without ceasing for our nation. I'm Jerry Stewart. I'd love to have you subscribe. The more subscribers I have, the better chance I have of actually reaching out to more and more people. Spread the word that I'm going to be bringing you another sometime very soon. God bless you. Bye.